Thank you, and it's welcome to the afternoon session of day 2. I hope you had a great lunch, lots of exciting conversations, and hope you can save the rest of them for the break. I'll give you a few seconds to settle in. Yeah, I'm really pleased to continue this theme of AI and science coming together, and I can't think of beginning the afternoon session with Larry Zitnick, who has been a veteran computer vision researcher and decided to switch to chemistry and use all of Meta's compute for good, for harnessing that, for creating the largest data sets in chemistry, in quantum chemistry, and I believe he'll tell us something about that and much more. So I'll give this to Larry now.
Welcome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today. I really appreciate it. This is an amazing group of people. The talks that we've seen so far, I think, have been blowing me away. So hopefully this one does as well. So one thing that fascinates me is how the perception of AI for science has changed over the last couple of years. When we talk about AI for science now, and you think about how the population, the community thinks about it, a lot of times images like this pop into your head, of a robot working in a lab, playing with test tubes, and basically performing science by themselves and coming up with discovery by themselves. And this is, I think, even more amplified by certain statements such as these, we should expect PhD-level intelligence from our AI. ChatGPT-5 is going to bring PhD-level intelligence. But at the same time, we're struck by things such as this. I just went last night and tried to type in some similar things to this, and I saw the same thing. Gemini had trouble picking out how many R's were in raspberry. Right? So it's very confusing, I think to us. I think it's very confusing to the overall field. What is going on? How should we think about AI for science? And I think one of the things is we need not to think about AI for science as one about replacement, about replacing our scientists. We need to think about it more as one that empowers our scientists. How can we build technology that is going to take our scientists to the next level, which is going to lead to new insights? So if we go back in time and we think about, what technologies did this, what technologies most empowered the scientists of today, what comes to mind? For me, it's microscopes, it's telescopes. What did these technologies bring? They brought brand new insights. We learned about bacteria. We learned about cells. We learned that Jupiter has 4 moons. Or at least back then it had 4 moons. It has a lot more now. Right? And today, we keep advancing the science. Now, we can't just look at cells of bacteria. We can even see atoms. And this is a scanning tunneling microscope, which you can see things at the atomic level. And one thing that, I don't know, how many people have been to a lab, an experimental lab like this that does these? I'm always fascinated by how this really expensive equipment is always covered in aluminum foil. It's let's build this thing, we're spending years on it. Oh, wait, we need one more thing. Let's cover it with aluminum foil. Okay, now it's great. I don't know, it's just kind of funny if you go, and it can even move atoms around. So this is an amazing technology. It allows us to see the atomic world like we've never been able to see it before. But it's still missing one thing, which is generally this is taking snapshots of the atomic world. Where really what we want to be able to do is we want to understand the dynamics of the real world. And there are some technologies that allow us to do this, but for most practical applications, we have no way of seeing how the world is actually interacting at that level. So how can we understand the world better at this atomic level, understand what is going on? The way to do that is through simulation. Now, why do we want to simulate the world at the atomic level? Well, for me, and one of the applications that I was most concerned about and most interested in was climate, reducing our CO2 emissions, mitigating climate change. And we see all these different sources of CO2. There's numerous of them, many of them. And if we want to decarbonize our society, we need all these different methods to decarbonize all these different applications. And each one of these can take like water, CO2, other feedstocks, and you do this thing called upcycling to then greenify all these applications. But that upcycling requires understanding what's happening at the atomic level. These are chemical reactions. These are things that they need new materials, that we need to understand the world at that level if we want to achieve this end goal. All right, let's just give a concrete example. So here we have a car, the Toyota Mirai. It is a fuel cell car. In the fuel cell car, there's a fuel cell underneath the hood, has an anode and a cathode, and on that cathode is a catalyst, right? So how does this catalyst work? What we want to do is we want to convert hydrogen and oxygen into electricity and water. So one of the reactions is oxygen into water. So we have our catalyst there. We have an oxygen molecule. And what it's going to do is going to be attracted by that catalyst. And as it comes in contact with that catalyst, it's going to weaken the bond between the two oxygen atoms. And because that bond's weakened, it allows the hydrogens or protons to come into contact with the one oxygen and pull it off to create a water molecule. And the same thing when the other two hydrogens come in. Now they just have a single oxygen there. It can pull that off as well. And we want to understand these type of dynamics. Because when we pick out a catalyst, we want a catalyst that's just right. If you track those oxygen atoms too strongly, they'll just cover the entire catalyst and your reaction will grind to a halt. If it doesn't attract them strongly enough, it doesn't have any impact. So what we want is a catalyst which is just right, which allows that chemical reaction to proceed as easily as possible. But the problem, so what is the problem? The problem is this catalyst. It's made of platinum, which means it's expensive. And we need to find alternatives if we want these technologies to be feasible economically. All right, so how do we actually do these simulations today? Well, you take a bunch of atoms, you put them in a box, then you simulate them, you compute the forces, you update atom positions based upon those forces, and you repeat, and you can run these simulations. Easy peasy. The problem is how do you compute these forces? Well, the forces are computed using something called density functional theory, which I think Chris Bishop gave an excellent intro on earlier today, so you probably don't even need me to describe it much. But what it does is it computes the energies and forces of these atoms by estimating the electron density of all the electrons. The problem is that it is order n cubed with the number of electrons, which means in practice, if you have 10 atoms, you can run a simulation, or you can do an estimation in like minutes. But if you have 100 atoms, 500 atoms, 1,000 atoms, it can take hours, days, or weeks to do these calculations. Imagine if you're doing research and you have to wait days to get a single calculation back. It is going to slow you down dramatically. And if you do things such as nanoparticles or proteins, there's way too many atoms in these things, so you're not even going to try, right? So a fundamental question remains is, how can we take those calculations, those simulations, and instead of taking days or weeks, can we get them down to less than a second? And that is a problem. So this is where AI, I think, can come to the rescue. And now what I want to talk about is if AI can come to the rescue, how do we do that? How do we bring not just Meta and, let's say, my research team involved in this, but how do we bring in the entire community to work on this problem? I mean, material science, chemistry, and the AI and ML researchers. So if you want to bring in the AI and ML community, what do you need first? You need a simple problem, one that they can understand. They don't need a chemistry degree to understand. And what's beautiful about this problem is it's incredibly simple. The input, the 3D atom positions, and their atomic numbers. The output, a single number, which is the energy, and then the forces on each atom. Easy peasy. You don't need to know much about the problem to understand what the inputs and outputs are. So this opens it up to a broad swath of the community, which is awesome. So what's the other thing you want to do if you want to attract the ML or the AI community? Will they work on a problem when you only have 1,000 data points, or 10,000 data points, or 100,000 data points? No. It's too small. They'll look at it as too niche. they won't want to work on it because they can't use their biggest, best neural networks on it, right? You need lots of data. So that's the first thing our team did. We said the biggest limiting factor right now on doing these computational simulations is a lack of data. And the data, what we need to do is we need to run those expensive DFT calculations to create a lot of training data. So over the years, we created the Open Catalyst data sets, the Open DAC, which has moss in it data sets, the Open Materials data sets, and the Open Molecules data set. And just to give you a sense, the most latest one, the Open Molecules, which released in May, had all these different types of molecules in it. So it is like biomolecules, electrolytes, which are good for batteries, metal complexes, all sorts of different types of molecules. The problem is you can't just take a bunch of atoms and throw it into a box and run a simulation and have it be effective. You actually need to take the atoms and take the structures that the practitioners care about. They have to be kind of close to what a real atomic system would look like if you want your model to work well, which means we needed a lot of people with domain expertise to help us create this data set. And for Open Molecules, we worked with numerous partners to make this data set possible. And this is really a community effort with all of these different people from national labs, from different universities, pitching in and telling us what type of calculations do you want to do. And then we took that back and then we just ran them at scale at Meta. So across all these different data sets, I counted it the other day, we had over 40 external collaborators to make and realize all these different data sets. So in total, they contain over 500 million different structures, which contain over 30 billion atoms, and required over 10 billion core hours of compute. To give you a sense of that, that's running hundreds of thousands of Facebook servers for over a year to do this. Luckily, we were able to use the compute that nobody else wanted. Basically, when the sun's over the Pacific Ocean and not as many people are on Meta, or like when they're not running cat videos, they're running DFT calculations in the background, right? So that's how we can get away with it. Luckily, if they get preempted, we don't care. We just want a lot of data. Thank you, Meta. Mark. All right, we just released a bunch of other data sets as well. I won't go into that, but these are like follow-up data sets to that as well. All right, so let's talk a little about the neural networks, because that's kind of the fun part. So the way that we represent these atomic systems is we have a graph neural network where each atom is a node, and then neighboring atoms basically create the edges. And then we basically have a simple update function, which is we have an embedding for the node, and then we have a message that we pass between the different atoms. And that's the neural network. It's fairly simple. And one of the questions you might have, OK, what is representation? How do we represent the information in each node? Well, I'm a computer vision. Well, I was formerly a computer vision person. I think a lot about computer vision. So in computer vision, we would think about a representation as a bunch of planar channels on an image. For atoms, we have a bunch of atoms, with another, like an atom with all the other atoms surrounding it. You kind of want to know what that neighborhood looks like. What would you use? Well, you'd want spherical channels, because that kind of encodes what's at every different angle around that atom. So how do we represent those spherical channels? Well, as a computer vision person, when I first looked at this, I was like, all right, that's easy. Same way we do planar channels, we'll just discretize it. But it doesn't work that well. There's another method where you can take it and you can use a set of basis functions, which are called the spherical harmonics, which basically represent that spherical channel instead by a set of coefficients with those basis functions. And the reason I bring this up is when we do message passing, we want to do, if you have 2 points in 3D, there's only 1 degree of freedom remaining, which is that rotation that goes between those two atoms. And when we do that message passing, we want to do a convolution. And if you do that convolution the traditional way, that was being done, it takes order L to the 6, where L is the degree of those spherical harmonics I mentioned, which made it computationally really expensive. But you ask, if we can bring in a broader set of the community, do we get new ideas? Or can we make breakthroughs in this area by bringing in people with backgrounds that are different from what traditionally looked at this problem? And it turns out that if we borrow ideas from computer vision, thinking about things in the Fourier domain, and this convolution is really just a 1D Fourier convolution, we can take that and get it down to L to the cubed, which makes the calculations much faster. We can use larger L, which means it has higher resolution, which means we get greater accuracy. So I think this is one of the great examples of different areas borrowing knowledge from each other and making a significant breakthrough. The details of this is really cool. There's a YouTube video. You should check it out if you're interested in the mathematics behind it. All right, let's go back to the data. So what I'm showing you here is Open Molecules data set, and that is a diagram showing you which atoms occur next to each other, which ones are local neighbors of each other. So like oxygen and carbon are really like often next to each other. But in this data set, let's say gold and copper were never seen together next to each other. If we look at all of our data sets, you get different kind of combinations. But together, you actually get like a nice coverage over all the possible combinations of different atoms sitting next to each other. So what we wanted to do was see what would happen if we trained a single model across all the data sets that we had created, and we called this the Universal Model of Atoms, or UMA for short. And we put this into one model, and it's good for all sorts of different stuff. Now, one interesting question here is now we're training on huge amounts of data. We want this model to have a lot of capacity, but at the same time, it needs to be efficient. If it's not fast, then why don't you just run DFT, right? So it has to be as efficient as possible. So here, I think, is another interesting example where we borrowed an idea from LLMs, which use mixture of experts, and we tailored it specifically for our problem using mixture of linear experts, which allowed us to scale the model size while keeping the inference time, the compute time, the same. All right. So a good question you might now have is, how good are these models? Their approximations of DFT, et cetera, are they useful? So one thing we did just recently is we actually created a demo where you can drag atoms around and play with it. And then I have blown hours playing with this demo. But you can see here, as you pull these, just look at the complex interactions that you see, how different bonds form as you pull the different atoms around. And you can see how things just get restructured dynamically. It gives you so much intuition about the world when you can actually play with the atoms themselves. We're hoping to release this demo to the public, so that way I think this would be awesome for like high school chemistry classes and that sort of thing. Okay, it's just so much fun. Like I gave it to my daughter, and she's like, "Oh, I have to show my chemistry teacher this." So, but you can see like at the end, there's like the CO2 formed and everything. It's just so much fun. All right, so qualitatively, it's a lot of fun. It kind of works. Let's talk about things quantitatively. So to measure it quantitatively, we trained on DFT data. But as Chris Bishop mentioned earlier today, really the ground truth is something called coupled cluster. And the DFT is really expensive to compute. Coupled cluster is insanely expensive to compute. It's n to the 7th, where n is the number of electrons. So you can only do this with a small number of systems. So what we did is we wanted to measure the accuracy of DFT relative to coupled cluster and our models relative to coupled cluster. So here what you can see is the distribution of errors for the level of DFT that we trained our models on, which is a very high level of theory for DFT. The calculations took quite a bit of time. It's omega B97M-V. Now, if you look at other levels of DFT, the errors are much bigger. And this is generally what people will use a lot of times in practice because the calculations are much more inexpensive, right? It only takes like half the time or a tenth the time of what the highest level of theory might require. Now, if you look at the UMA models, what do you get? You get these errors. And what I found shocking was how much better they were from other levels of DFT and how closely they matched the errors that we see with the highest level of the data that it was actually trained on. And to me, this is like vindication that, you know what, these models are getting really good. They're approximating DFT very, very closely. They are practically useful. And we're just beginning to see what the utility of these models are. We finished the data set last April. It took us a month to train the model. We sat on the model for a week. We did all our tests on it. It looked like it passed. And we open sourced it all and just gave it all out there. So we ourselves don't even know what the full capability of this model is. And we're still trying to like figure it out. But we're hoping to work with the community and see where the community uses it. And then we can further improve the models, et cetera. But this kind of fast turnaround, I think, is really important to make sure the community is moving as quickly as possible as well. This looks really promising, but I do want to see this opening up new science, which is still TBD. All right, so another problem that I talked about was computing absorption energy. And we have a catalyst, we have a molecule on top of it, and we want to know how strongly does that catalyst attract that molecule on top of the catalyst. And this was a problem that we wanted to study for like the last 5 or 6 years. It's an initial problem we looked at because it has so many applications in green hydrogen generation, sustainable fuels, like a lot of the climate applications that we were talking about. And these are the models through time, and we had a certain target accuracy that we were going after. And the latest UMA models have beaten our target accuracy, which gives us another indication that these models can be really effective. And I found that like really, like we've been working it so long, to see that jump was just amazing. And then another application I think Chris Bishop talked about and others have talked about as well, which is discovering or trying to look for new materials that might be stable. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this problem, let's say we want to have a new material made up of zinc and copper. What you do is you basically take zinc and copper atoms, you put them into a box, and you see, is there energy less than zinc and copper, by themselves? And if it is, then you say, oh, this might be stable. But if you find another combination of those atoms which have a lower energy, then you say the one that has higher energy is less likely to be stable. And you can do the same thing if you find another one of a different proportion of different atoms. And as long as you're on that convex hull, it's possible that that combination of atoms, that material could be stable. There's a potential of that. There's tons of asterisks on this, but this is like the machine learning view of the problem. And this is a benchmark for this problem. I'm not going to describe these numbers. Obviously, UMA's at the top, but there's one point that I want to make here, which is if you look at these models, a lot of them are actually pretty close to UMA. And the reason for that is you look at which of these models used the OMAT, the Open Materials data set, and you see it's all these models up at the top. When we first put out the model, we were heads and tails above like a lot of the other models that were out there. But by putting out this data set, everybody else could retrain their models using this new, improved, much larger data set. And it basically took the entire community and poof, lifted it up. And what this says to me is it's the data that makes such a big difference on a lot of these things. Models are cool. Machine learning people, AI people, we love new models. But at the end of the day, it's the data sometimes that gives us a bigger bump than a new model architecture. I think this is an excellent example of that. All right, so I want to talk about some open challenges. We haven't solved it all. There's a lot of work to be done on this, but I'm going to talk about some even more forward challenges. The first one is time. You do one inference call on UMA, that's equivalent to running a simulation for 1 femtosecond, which is 1/millionth of 1/billionth of a second. If you run UMA for an entire day on a GPU, you can get up to 1 nanosecond, which is pretty cool, actually. You get up to like 10,000 atoms or 30,000 atoms if you have a lot of GPUs, and close to 1 nanosecond, which is an amazing ability. But a lot of the things we care about happen over much longer timescales. Chemical reactions, protein foldings, whether a material is going to stay durable in a chemical reaction, much longer timescales. So what we want to do is we want to make it even faster. We want to get up to 1 billion times faster than where we are now. So how do we get 1 billion times faster? It's not through writing more efficient code. I guarantee you that. And I also think it's not going to be coming from hardware anytime soon, unfortunately, either. So how can we do it? Well, I think this is where generative modeling could be super interesting. So right now, just to make an analogy, what we're doing is we have a frame from a video, and what we want to do is kind of predict the next frames that come up. And that's kind of what the UMA models and et cetera do. But what would be really cool is to have a model which, given a frame of a video, predicts what's going to happen half an hour ahead, an hour ahead, the next day, right? Thinking farther and farther into the future. And this is something that I think is super interesting to explore. I think it's something that is very unique to this domain that will be interesting to the AI community because we can generate our own data. It's a super interesting research problem, and I think one that is going to be very, massively studied, I think, in the next 2 to 3 years. And it's, I think, this is what I'm most excited about, if it's not obvious. All right. So this is one of the open problems that is out there right now. The other one, I think, is one that's really underappreciated, which is we have computational simulations, which I've been talking about this entire time, and then we have experiments that actually happen in the lab. And because we were able to do these computational simulations a little better, it got us a little bit closer. But there's still a huge gap. Even in the computational chemistry community and the experimental chemistry community, there is a big gap. And then if you say, would you experimentalists trust even less than computationalists? bunch of AI researchers pretending to be computationalists, right? So there's this gap between what's going on. So let me just give you an example of this. Tell you, yeah, I got some time, great. Tell you a little story. So I'm a machine learning person working with a lot of computational chemists. We want to see whether the models that we're building are actually going to be effective in the real world, doing real experiments. So we teamed up with the University of Toronto and another startup company to basically be as particle to explore whether these models were informative or not. So we looked at two reactions. One was HER, hydrogen evolution reaction, which takes water and electricity and creates hydrogen and oxygen. And then CO2RR, which is important for doing sustainable fuels, like creating aviation fuel, that sort of thing, from CO2 and hydrogen. All right. Now, if we want to look at those chemical reactions, and we want to find a new catalyst for this chemical reaction, so we say, OK, what catalysts exist that we could test out? Well, if we look at all these different public data sets, and we look at, there's a lot of criteria you wanted to say whether they're going to be stable in those reaction conditions. There's about 19,000 materials that could potentially be stable under those chemical conditions, and we wanted to see which one would be best. All right, so how do we go about doing these experiments? In my mind, this is the order of how things should happen. Out of those 19,000 materials, let's go and order a bunch of them, right? And then we will test them at scale and see which ones worked. And we'll match it up with our computational predictions. In my mind, testing them at scale was going to be the hard part, right? Because that's going to be a lot of experiments. Well, we went to the various companies and said, I want a tablespoon of this material. I want a tablespoon of this material. And the companies came back and said, I can't make that. I'm not going to do that. And they're like, well, give me $100,000 per material. Maybe I'd try to do it. And I found out that first step was nearly nobody was going to do it. So we had to go back to the drawing board. So the first thing we had to do was figure out a way to synthesize the materials. So we went and we tried out a bunch of different things. We reached out to tons of different companies, universities, et cetera. We finally found one that could synthesize a broad range of materials. And then we took those materials and we tried to stick them to the electrode to actually make a catalyst. Turned out they didn't stick to the electrode. So we had to find another way to synthesize the material. We found another way to synthesize the material. They actually finally stuck to the electrode. And then we had to see, we would make a material, but then you have to put it into another machine to tell you whether it's a material that is what you wanted to make. Was it actually what I wanted? And it turned out it wasn't actually the material that we wanted. It had oxidized, because it was exposed to the air too long. So we're like, shoot, we got to find another way to do this. So it goes back again. And this whole process took over 2.5 years. 2.5 years. And for me, coming from the AI community, I'm like, you got to be kidding me, because it was going so slow. But in any case, we were able to collect 700 materials for this study after doing all this work. And then we could finally test them at scale, which turned out to be the really, really easy part. All right. So what did we find? Well, for HER, we found this correlation. So we have predicted with the computational method, and we have observed on the x-axis there. And what you'll see is that there is a slight correlation. It is actually, we actually use this to kind of predict other materials we want to try, and it was fairly informative, but it wasn't like a nice, solid correlation that you would hope for. And this is for a very, very simple chemical reaction. HER is about as simple as you get. Now, for CO2RR, it's a much, much more complex chemical reaction. All these different pathways, there's tons of different products you can have. It's an insanely complex, it's like the opposite end of the spectrum. And for that one, we got a scatter plot like this, which, yeah, it's correlated, ish in the paper, but it's not going to be practically useful. It's too much variation in these experiments. All right. So what this told me was, no matter how far we get on the computational side, there's still more work to be done. This isn't an easy plug and chug problem. So why is that? Why is this so challenging? Well, one of the reasons is that this is what we modeled. Super simple catalyst, single molecule on top. It's a clean room example, as perfect as you get. The real world is much messier. It's not just a single molecule. You have solvents, you have water molecules running around. The catalyst surface is going to be all jagged and whatnot. There's all these other factors at play. So we need to have our computational simulations need not just be simple models, but need to be much more complex. The other problem, and this is on the computational side, the other problem is on the experimental side. Because you can take the exact same recipe, give it to 2 different PhD students, and you will get very different results, as anybody who's in the experimental side of chemistry knows. And this is a huge issue. Like we even had the same PhD student, the same postdoc, running the exact same experiment with the exact same equipment one day after the next, and you get a different result. You know, it's tough to make progress when you don't have reproducible numbers, you don't have reproducible results. It's something that's really, I think, holding us back right now as a community. All right, so if we want to go from computational simulations to experiments in the lab, what do we need? How are we going to bridge this gap finally? We're going to need data. As everybody says, we need data. But we need the right type of data, specifically experimental data. So we need to be able to synthesize, make new materials. How do we make them in the lab? We need to characterize them. When I say characterize, I mean actually determine what it is that we made, and then you need to test. And if we look at the synthesize and characterization, essentially make the materials and tell me what you made. This is analogous to the CASP challenge in protein folding that I'm sure all of you are aware of. But we do not have a CASP challenge for material science right now. And I think this is one of the biggest limiting factors for the material science community right now. So what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to synthesize the materials and do it in a reproducible way. So if I do it, you know, in California and somebody else does it in Toronto, then you'll get the same result. We need to put a lot of effort into that. And then we need to take those data sets and we need to make them public. And just because I know you're probably thinking about this, mining the literature is not going to be good enough. Because the data in the literature is really hard to reproduce. They don't give you negative results. You only know it worked. And and a lot of times the details for how they actually, the baking recipe itself, there's missing details in it. All right. So we are trying to fund an effort called the Materials Data Factory to get this going. It's still like very much in the early stages. But this is, I think, anybody who's interested in this space or creating something like this, please reach out. I think it is important. All right, just to conclude. So how do we get to the next breakthrough? And I think when we think about how do we make a breakthrough, it leads us directly to the end. Like, what does it mean to have a breakthrough as a chemist or as a material scientist? It means finding a new material that is amazing at some application X, where X is something that everybody cares about, right? If you're an AI person, what is a breakthrough? It's a brand new model that got, like, the previous baseline was here. It's a new model with a new architecture that gets you up here, that everybody's like, wow, that was really amazing, right? But the breakthroughs are just kind of the tip of the iceberg. What we really need is we need to build our foundation. And that foundation is super important if we're going to achieve those breakthroughs. And one of the hard things about building this foundation is that our incentives aren't always aligned with building that. Is the best paper that you read last year a paper that just reported a bunch of data that didn't even mention a brand new material? No. You know, is your best breakthrough in machine learning a data set which had baseline results of models trained on it? No. Are those the foundations that create the breakthrough later on? Yes. So I think if you're a reviewer, if you're in the field, is to think about, like, what are we doing that is creating this foundation? Unless we're going to be constantly trying to build these breakthroughs on a weak foundation, and we're not going to have the real impact that we want in the world with these models. So with that, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, go there. Go ahead.
to share all these amazing works. So I have the same interest to pursue the research in AI for science. And as a PhD student in robot learning, I do have very strong background in machine learning, but I do not have much background in chemistry or climate change. So my question is, how strong you think a person's background should be in this foundational area to make them eligible to pursue this research? Thank you.
It's a good question. It's not about your own knowledge. It's about who you work with, right? So if you are to, what made it possible for me to work on this was not me going off into a corner and opening up books and reading and learning a lot. I did that. But what really enabled that was I worked really closely with Zach Ulissi, who was faculty at CMU in the chemistry department early on. And he brought that domain expertise, and I brought the ML expertise, and working together is what enabled us to really make an impact. Because it's only through that communication, talking together, that light bulb turned on, which was you have this problem, you're making progress here, but you're lacking the data, and I have the compute, I can suddenly, and we can make that all work. So I think it's having the right collaborations. I personally found that what I did is I wrote an intro paper when I first got into this field. With the point of the intro paper, I just put it up on archive, at the time, was just to teach myself. So that I use that as an exercise to teach myself about the space. And you have to ask a lot of dumb questions. So when I'm around other domain experts, in my team there's a lot of domain experts, and I'm known for just asking the most rudimentary, high school chemistry, sometimes even, questions, because it's not my area of expertise. So I think it's the openness to allow yourself to be vulnerable as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Larry. I'm a material scientist by training, so thank you so much for the talk. It's very inspiring. But a lot of us who do material research or material experiments know there's no perfect material. So a lot of times we are stuck with the defects in the material, or sometimes what Professor Yagi mentioned yesterday, we discover new findings from defects. So can your model predict defects, and what did you learn from those? Yeah,
no, that's a great point. This is one of the things that has me really excited about these machine learning potentials that we're using, because before, if you wanted to basically do simulations on perfect materials because they would contain a smaller number of atoms. If you have defects, you need a much larger cell size, essentially, much more atoms to kind of represent those defects. And it's using these machine learning potentials, we can actually have much bigger cell sizes. We can study much larger systems, which I think will hopefully give us insights into which of these defects are actually productive, which are good defects versus which ones that aren't. So these models and everything just got accurate enough in the last year or two, and I still think the community is kind of grasping that. We're still trying to figure it out, but I think that exactly what you're mentioning is going to be where a lot of the most interesting science is going to occur, is in that, and studying where that is. And then one other thing too is we've seen the models generalize fairly well. So even though a lot of the data that we're training on is defect-free, is that because we run it with molecular dynamics, we add a lot of heat to the system, the atoms are moving around a bunch, is that it sees enough diversity that if you do give it something with a defect, the model still can work well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My training is as an ML researcher, and I was wondering about if you could elaborate a bit on what you've observed in terms of the scaling properties of models in this domain. So in NLP, one of the biggest findings ever was that there are scaling laws which predictably relate the amount that you increase model size, increase training data size, increase training data time, which predictably relate how much resources you invest to the performance you get out. Yep. And I was wondering, for this chemistry simulation domain, have we discovered similar empirical scaling laws that relate any of the quantities involved in your training process to your results? And if that was at all informative for your design choices in terms of mixture of experts, the size of your model, that sort of thing, or training data scale? Thank you.
It's an excellent question. Exactly, we were asking the exact same question. So last year when we were training the UMA model, because this is the first time that we were going to run something, I think before we would run it and we trained it on like 100 million data points, but now that we're going to scale to 500 million data points, et cetera, and go up even further, we wanted to understand the scaling relationships. So if you look at the UMA paper, it has the exact same plots that you would see in the scaling law papers from the LLMs, like the same ISO curves. I might be blanking on the right name, but basically it's the same curves that you see in like the OpenAI and the Llama papers, et cetera. And we observed the exact same behavior, which is you do get the exact same scaling laws that scale logarithmically with the amount of training data, model size, et cetera. What we learned from it was that basically we are limited right now on data and not on the model size. So we basically trained the model so that way, or picked out the model size so that way it was kind of optimal for the amount of data that we had. But going to larger model sizes, because we actually trained a UMA small, medium, and large, is the large was already hitting the limits of what the data would support. But if you look in there, you'll see like the nice same like log linear scaling laws that you're probably familiar with.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
All right. Hi, Larry. Thank you so much for the great talk. One question, when you're talking about the generative model to speed up the computational chemistry, I think that's a very charming idea. So, for example, like, when you talk about maybe use a diffusion model, right? So then my question is, can you really, one example I can think about is in DFT, you have a lot of geometry optimization. For example, thousands of steps to get a very stable stage. And then do you really think all this generative model can really across, you want to short basically the steps. You don't want to calculate the whole thousands of steps. Then if you use diffusion models, diffusion model also get many steps. So how would you prevent you lose the information and really capture the scientific process for it?
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. So there's a lot of, this is why I like it, because is it possible or not? Like, we don't know yet, and that's why it's such an exciting area to work on. And I think it's the same thing for, will machine learning models be able to approximate DFT to a high enough level of accuracy? 5 years ago, we didn't know the answer to it, which is why it's so exciting to study. And this is why this problem, I think, is really exciting. Where I see the problems in doing this is when you have, if you imagine like an energy surface, right? And you have one state that's here and another state that's here. If you have an energy surface that kind of goes like this, you'll probably, if you run an MD simulation or just run a simulation, it'll jump from here to here eventually and go back down, and you'll get like good samples on both, and you can use that as training data. One of the problems you run into, though, is if instead of this, it goes like this, where you have a high energy barrier. So if you run an MD simulation, it might never jump over that barrier. It's like if you run an MD simulation on diamonds, it will never go to graphite, right? Because it's like the energy barrier is too high. So there, I think we need to be much more smart about how we do the sampling. How do we find the local minima? And it's like, do you want to model the Boltzmann distribution as your end play or not? So I think there's a lot of kind of really interesting questions there. And to be frank with you, I don't see a way of doing it without a lot of compute. And that's something that our group is looking at right now, is instead of scaling up on the DFT calculation side, it's actually scaling up on the simulation side. So that way, we can have the analogous thing of large data sets of images for generative models, but doing that in the chemistry domain, and then training the models for that.
Sorry, one following question about that. I think it's quite possible for like simple simulation for single molecules. But when you talk about the cluster, I think the big challenge is really there. For example, you can do MD, but if you want to get accurate, you want to do AIMD, right? But you cannot do thousands of molecules in a cubicle for that.
The way that we'll probably pose the problem, at least initially, is we're going to assume the ground truth is the AI model. So we won't be doing AIMD, which is for everybody else, you would actually use DFT to run the MD simulations, which computationally would be too expensive. So what we would do is we would say, at least for studying the problem, that the AI models are close enough to the ground truth that we can use those. And then we would literally run some MD simulations for a really long time. Think hundreds of nanoseconds maybe, to kind of properly sample the space for problems that are of varying degrees of complexity of interest. And then that will hopefully serve as like a ground truth for then studying that problem within the machine learning community. And that's something that like our team is looking into right now, because like before we actually dive into and study a problem, a lot of times it's good to like, again, lay that foundation. What are your benchmarks? What are your evaluations? So that way we can then give that out to the community as well. So that way we can all kind of focus and study on the same problem and all make progress together on it.
Got it. Thank you.
The last question.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Larry. So I'm not a chemistry teacher, by the way, but I do care about teaching kids science, and I'm looking forward to the tool available. I'm willing to pay for that. If we pay for ChatGPT, I'm willing to pay for that. A question is, as a fellow CMU guy, have you heard of Emerald Cloud Labs?
Yes.
Yeah. So the picture with the two cake with different cooks, maybe solved by robots. Have you think about collaborating with them?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think there is a lot of work going on right now with self-driving labs. You know, at CMU, University of Toronto, with the Acceleration Consortium is another good example as well. So I think there's a lot of work being put into that. I hope it works. You know, it's tough. Even the machines that we're using, though, like sometimes we're not producing reproducible results. So I don't think it's just a pure automation. It's doing the right type of automation. And I think a lot of that is still, I'm not an experimentalist, so I'm obviously out of my domain expertise here. But you know, I think there's still a lot of good research and even like there's no CRISPR, you know, for this domain. And I don't think it's like trivial to come up with one. I think it is a very challenging problem.
Maybe one more.
So great progress, but I want to pick your brain on what are the approaches or directions that could enable model discover new materials by itself or a new branch of chemistry? Yeah. Yeah.
So how can you discover? So what I did mention using generative models to kind of skip ahead in the time frame and doing these MD simulations. You can also use generative models to generate brand new materials, brand new molecules, et cetera. So this is something that we've done as well. Chris Bishop talked about it this morning. And those actually work like reasonably well, as long as you do it the right way, where you have, you basically have a diffusion model, flow matching model, that sort of thing. You generate a whole bunch of materials, and then it gives you a bunch of candidates. And then what you want to do is you want to basically weed through those as quickly as possible. Right? So you just need good verification techniques to see if they actually have the properties that you want for whatever application you're going after. So I think like these technologies have only been around for a year or two. I think the chemistry and material science communities are just kind of picking them up right now. I think we'll see a lot more of that going into the future. I think Omar talked about it yesterday as well. They're using them for MOFs. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Now, it'll be interesting how creative it can get. Like if you go really far off, you think about using like reinforcement learning, and then like you have an optimization technique that you're trying, and then you come up with a MOF-like new material that nobody even thought of. Like that could be possible, but I think right now like people aren't thinking quite that far ahead yet, but maybe we should.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.